June 4th, 1942. 10:22 a.m. Akagi's flight deck explodes into a 200-foot wall of fire as fuel-soaked bombers detonate one after another, melting steel, vaporizing men, and ending Japan's 6-month reign over the Pacific in less than 6 minutes. This is the moment everything changed. And almost nobody saw it coming, except for one man the Japanese Navy never even knew existed. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next incredible stories, events, and inspiring moments from history. Join our community as we keep uncovering the past one forgotten hero at a time. His name was Joseph Rochefort. He wasn't a general, he wasn't a pilot, he wasn't even particularly famous within his own navy. He was a crypt analyst, a man who spent his days in a windowless basement beneath Pearl Harbor, staring at strings of meaningless numbers scrawled across cheap paper, while admirals and politicians made the decisions that history remembers. Nobody saluted him in the hallways. Nobody wrote his name in newspapers. But by the time the sun set on June 4th, 1942, Joseph Rochefort and a handful of overworked, underfunded code breakers in a basement office called Station Hypo had done something the entire combined power of the Imperial Japanese Navy could not stop. They had already won the Battle of Midway before a single Japanese ship even reached the horizon. 4 fleet carriers, 248 aircraft, over 3,000 of Japan's most experienced sailors and pilots. Gone in less than 24 hours, and almost none of it would have happened the way it did without a quiet, irritable, half-forgotten naval officer who refused to accept the official story being handed down from Washington. To understand how staggering this collapse really was, you have to understand what the Pacific looked like 6 months earlier. December 1941. Pearl Harbor in flames. 8 American battleships sunk or crippled in a single morning. Over 2,000 Americans killed before breakfast was even finished. It was the most devastating surprise attack in modern naval history, and it worked exactly as Japan's planners intended. In the months that followed, Imperial Japan didn't slow down, it accelerated. The Philippines fell. Singapore fell. The Dutch East Indies fell. Wake Island, Guam, Hong Kong, one after another fell like dominoes stacked across an ocean. Japanese carrier task forces struck as far as Ceylon, sinking British ships in the Indian Ocean, almost as an afterthought. The Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier strike force, the Kido-Butai, had become something close to a myth, an unstoppable machine of 4 to 6 fleet carriers, crewed by the most experienced naval aviators on Earth, many of whom had been flying combat missions since the war in China began in 1937. American naval planners weren't just worried. Some of them were genuinely terrified. The United States Pacific Fleet, badly mauled at Pearl Harbor, had exactly 3 carriers left in the entire ocean: Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, the last of which had been hammered so badly during the Battle of the Coral Sea that engineers in Hawaii believed she would need 3 months in dry dock just to be seaworthy again. 3 carriers against an empire that had humiliated every navy it encountered for half a year straight. The math looked impossible. The momentum looked unstoppable. And Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo believed they were about to deliver the final blow. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of Japan's combined fleet, had designed an operation so massive it would eventually involve nearly 200 warships spread across the North Pacific. The plan was elegant on paper and devastating if it succeeded. Strike Midway Atoll. A tiny speck of coral and sand roughly 1,300 miles from Hawaii, just hard enough to force the wounded American carriers out of Pearl Harbor and into open water, where Yamamoto's overwhelming surface fleet battleships, cruisers, and the brand-new 4-carrier strike force would crush them in a single decisive battle, lure them out, trap them, annihilate them, and force Washington to the negotiating table before American industrial power had time to fully wake up. Yamamoto knew the clock was running. He had told Tokyo plainly months earlier that Japan had perhaps 6 months, maybe a year at most, to force a decisive victory before the United States shipyards and factories overwhelmed everything Japan could build. Midway was supposed to be that decisive victory. Instead, it became the day everything fell apart, And the reason it fell apart wasn't bad luck. It was a man nobody in the Japanese Navy had ever heard of, sitting in a basement refusing to give up on a hunch. Joseph Rochefort had spent years building a small exhausted team inside a cramped, poorly ventilated basement room at Pearl Harbor that the staff had nicknamed the Dungeon. Officially, it was Station Hypo, the Navy's combat intelligence unit assigned to crack Japan's naval communications. Unofficially, it was a handful of sleep-deprived linguists, mathematicians, and traffic analysts working brutal hours on intercepted Japanese radio transmissions encoded in a cipher known as JN-25. Rochefort himself wasn't a glamorous figure. He was prickly, intensely private, prone to clashing with superior officers who didn't appreciate being told their assumptions were wrong. He worked in a bathrobe some nights because he refused to leave the basement long enough to change clothes. He survived on coffee and instinct, and in the spring of 1942, his instinct told him something the rest of the Pacific Fleet's leadership didn't want to hear, that Japan was about to launch an enormous operation, and that the target referred to only by the coded designation AF was almost certainly Midway. Some senior officers in Washington disagreed. They believed AF more likely pointed toward Hawaii itself, or somewhere else entirely. It would have been easy, even reasonable, for Rochefort to defer to the brass in Washington. Instead, he and his team designed one of the simplest, boldest deceptions of the entire war. If Rochefort was right, this was the moment that would either confirm everything or destroy his credibility completely. He had Midway's garrison transmit an uncoded plain-language radio message, a routine, almost boring complaint about a broken saltwater distillation unit claiming the base was running short on fresh water. It was bait dropped in plain sight with nothing to disguise it. Within 48 hours, Japanese radio intercepts picked up exactly what Rochefort had hoped for. A coded Japanese transmission referencing that AF was reportedly short on fresh water. The trap had worked. Target AF was Midway. There was no longer any reasonable doubt. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet, had his answer not from spies, not from captured documents, but from a man in a basement who trusted mathematics over assumption. And Rochefort's team didn't stop there. Piece by piece, intercepted message by intercepted message, they reconstructed almost the entire shape of Yamamoto's operation, the date of the attack, June 4th. The direction the Japanese carrier force would approach from the composition of the invasion fleet, even rough troop numbers for the planned landing force. It was an almost unbelievable intelligence triumph, assembled not through brute force, but through patience, obsession, and a willingness to challenge official assumptions that everyone else had simply accepted as fact. Now Nimitz faced a decision that would have terrified almost any commander in his position. He had 3 carriers. Japan was bringing 4, backed by battleships, cruisers, and nearly 200 supporting vessels. If Rochefort's intelligence was wrong, even slightly wrong, Nimitz risked throwing away the last meaningful carrier force the United States had left in the Pacific. There would be no recovering from that mistake. Yorktown alone was a gamble in itself. Damaged at Coral Sea weeks earlier, naval engineers had told Nimitz she needed 90 days in dry dock for proper repairs. Nimitz didn't have 90 days. He had roughly 72 hours. He ordered the shipyard at Pearl Harbor to work around-the-clock welders, electricians, and engineers swarming over Yorktown in shifts that never stopped patching, reinforcing, and restoring just enough of her combat capability to get her back to sea. It was reckless by any peacetime standard. It was also exactly the kind of calculated risk that intelligence, real verified intelligence, made possible. Because Nimitz wasn't gambling blindly anymore. He knew when the Japanese were coming. He knew roughly where. And that meant he could do something Yamamoto never expected: position his 3 carriers, not where Japanese doctrine assumed American forces would be, but in a quiet stretch of open ocean northeast of Midway that Japanese reconnaissance patterns had completely failed to cover. The Americans weren't reacting to Japan's plan anymore. They were waiting inside it. On the other side of the ocean, Admiral Chuichi Nagumo had no idea any of this had happened. Nagumo commanded the most powerful carrier strike force the world had ever assembled, 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, carrying 248 aircraft, and many of the same veteran aircrews who had devastated Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. Japanese naval intelligence had assured him the nearest American carriers were at least 2 days away, likely still recovering near Hawaii. As far as Nagumo knew, the Americans weren't supposed to be anywhere near Midway. On the morning of June 4th, his first strike wave hit Midway's airbase at dawn, suppressing it but failing to fully destroy it. Following standard doctrine, Nagumo ordered a second strike prepared, and that meant pulling his reserve aircraft, 93 planes loaded with ship-killing torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, specifically held in reserve in case American carriers appeared, and rearming them instead with land attack bombs meant for hitting the island a second time. Crews swarmed across the hangar decks, unbolting torpedoes, wheeling out high-explosive bombs, refueling aircraft, in careful methodical work that simply could not be rushed. And then, in the middle of that rearming process, a single scout plane radioed back a sighting that shattered every assumption Japan had built this entire operation on. Enemy surface ship spotted. Then 8 minutes later, the report that should have changed everything. The enemy is accompanied by what appears to be a carrier. Nagumo now faced an impossible choice. His Midway strike planes were returning low on fuel, needing to land immediately. His flight decks were crowded with bombers that had just been rearmed with the wrong ordnance for a carrier engagement. He could launch immediately with mismatched weapons, or recover his planes first, rearm everything correctly, and then launch one overwhelming, properly armed strike. Doctrine and his most trusted advisors all pointed toward patience. Commander Minoru Genda, the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, had advised exactly that approach hours earlier from his sickbed. Never send a divided strike against enemy carriers. It was the textbook decision. It was the experienced decision. And because of Joseph Rochefort's basement, it was about to become the most catastrophic decision of the entire Pacific War. While Nagumo's crews worked frantically to clear decks, recover aircraft, and rearm bombers, fuel hoses dragging across open decks crowded with stacked torpedoes and bombs that should have already been struck back below American aircraft were already in the air, climbing toward his position from carriers he didn't even know were there. The first wave of American attacks came in piecemeal and brutal. 41 Devastator torpedo bombers flying in from 3 different squadrons pressed suicidal low-altitude attacks straight into walls of Japanese anti-aircraft fire. 35 were shot down. Not a single torpedo found its target. On paper it looked like a slaughter, a one-sided massacre with nothing gained. But that sacrifice did something Nagumo never noticed until it was far too late. It pulled every single Japanese fighter plane down to wave-top altitude, chasing the torpedo bombers, leaving the high sky completely undefended. And that was the exact moment Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey's dive bombers from Enterprise arrived at 14,000 feet, finding nothing but open, unguarded sky above 4 of the most valuable warships on Earth. What happened in the next 6 minutes erased half of Japan's carrier striking power. Dive bombers rolled into near-vertical attacks against Akagi and Kaga simultaneously, while a separate squadron from Yorktown struck Soryu at almost the same instant. The Japanese carriers, arranged in a tight formation built for mutual anti-aircraft defense, suddenly became concentrated, helpless targets. Akagi took her first bomb hit near the flight deck's central elevator, detonating in the upper hangar among fully fueled, fully armed aircraft parked wingtip to wingtip. A second bomb followed seconds later, rupturing fuel lines and igniting a chain reaction of secondary explosions as bombs and torpedoes cooked off across the hangar bay. Flames shot 200 feet into the air. Within minutes, Akagi was dead in the water, her bridge choking with black smoke, her flight deck a blistered ruin. Kaga died even faster, hit by 4 bombs in rapid succession, one striking near the command island and killing nearly everyone inside it instantly. Soryu absorbed 3 direct hits within 2 minutes, transforming into a floating furnace so intense that rescue crews could only pull survivors from the water, not from the ship itself. Three of Japan's four fleet carriers, each over 650 feet of mobile air power, representing years of construction and irreplaceable trained crews, became uncontrollable infernos in less time than it takes to watch this video so far. By the time the sun set on June 4, 1942, the myth of Japanese naval invincibility, built across 6 straight months of unbroken victories from Pearl Harbor to the Indian Ocean, had collapsed in a single morning because of a basement office, a fake water shortage, and a stubborn cryptanalyst who refused to accept what he was told to believe. But the carnage wasn't finished. Hiryu, the fourth Japanese carrier, had been separated from the main formation and escaped the initial American strike entirely. Her commander, Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, watched 3 sister carriers burn from 10 miles away and refused to simply retreat. He launched everything he had left, finding Yorktown and putting 3 bombs into her deck, then launching a second wave that struck her again with torpedoes, leaving the American carrier listing at 17 degrees, with her crew ordered to abandon ship. For one brief terrible moment, it looked like Japan might salvage something from the disaster, a trade of 3 carriers for 1. It would not last. Hiryu's location was now known, and American dive bombers were already in the air closing in on the last Japanese carrier standing, carrying a reckoning that would finish what Rochefort's basement had started before the battle ever began. What happens next determines not just the outcome of a single battle, but the entire trajectory of the Pacific War, the fate of Admiral Yamamoto's combined fleet, racing through the darkness, and whether Japan's last carrier and its commander will share the same fiery grave as the 3 that came before it. In Part 2, we go inside the final hours of the most lopsided naval disaster in modern history. The desperate scramble to save what remains of Japan's carrier force, the catastrophic collision in the dark that will doom 2 more warships, and the moment Admiral Yamamoto himself is forced to make the one decision he never imagined he would have to give the order to retreat. The dive bombers found Hiryu late in the afternoon, and within minutes, Japan's last carrier joined her 3 sisters in the fire. 4 bombs tore through her flight deck in the same merciless pattern that had already destroyed Akagi Kaga and Soryu. Fueled aircraft exploded across her hangar. Flames climbed through her superstructure. By nightfall, she was a blazing wreck dead in the water, and Admiral Taman Yamaguchi chose to stay aboard rather than abandon the ship he had fought to save. In less than 8 hours, every fleet carrier in the most powerful strike force ever assembled was burning, sinking, or already gone. 300 miles to the west aboard the battleship Yamato, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto still didn't know how bad it was. Radio discipline had collapsed across the fleet. Fragments arrived instead of reports. Akagi reported fires, then went silent. Kaga's last transmission read simply heavy damage, unable to navigate. Soryu sent nothing at all after the first attack. Only Hiryu kept talking long enough to report her counterstrikes against an American carrier before she too went quiet. Yamamoto's staff sat in the operations room of the most powerful battleship on Earth, surrounded by 18-inch guns that could not help them, waiting on a silence that grew heavier with every passing hour. By early evening, the truth was undeniable. All 4 carriers were lost or dying. Yamamoto had built this operation himself, nearly 200 ships spread across the North Pacific, a diversion in the Aleutians, an invasion force of 5,000 troops, and behind it all, his own main body of 7 battleships, meant to finish off whatever the carriers left behind. The entire plan rested on one assumption, that the Americans would react slowly, rushing out from Pearl Harbor straight into a trap. Instead, the trap had been set for him. His operations officer, Commander Yasuji Watanabe, proposed the only move that might still salvage something. Converge the whole combined fleet and force a night surface battle where American air power meant nothing and Japanese gunnery and torpedoes still ruled. Yamamoto still had 11 battleships, 16 cruisers, dozens of destroyers. If he could drag the American carriers into a night fight, the math might still favor him. That evening he gave the order. Every ship within range was to converge at maximum speed, including the invasion transports, which reversed course and turned east into the dark, racing toward an enemy that had no intention of waiting for them. The geometry was against him from the start. His battleships could make 27 knots at best. If Spruance simply pulled the American carriers east at 30 knots, the distance would open faster than Yamamoto could close it. And why would Spruance stay and fight a night battle against superior Japanese surface forces when he had already won everything there was to win? Captain Kuroshima laid the numbers out on the chart table that night. Even in the best case, the fleet would arrive at dawn with no air cover, no reconnaissance, and no margin for a single mistake. One American submarine in the wrong place could turn the rescue mission into a second disaster. Shortly after midnight, new reports confirmed what the geometry had already predicted. The Americans were withdrawing east. Spruance wasn't taking the bait. There would be no night battle, and any Japanese force still steaming east at dawn would meet the same dive bombers that had just burned 4 carriers to the waterline. Then came a second blow, quieter than the first, but in some ways worse. Intercepted radio analysis suggested the Americans hadn't simply gotten lucky. They had known the plan in advance. Not just the target, but the timing, the approach, the deployments. Word of it moved through the staff like ice water. It wasn't bad fortune that had destroyed the Kido Butai. It was an enemy who had read the script before the curtain ever rose. In the hours before dawn on June 5th, Yamamoto made the call no one in that operations room had ever expected to hear from him. Withdraw. The Midway operation was cancelled. The invasion transports would turn back to Saipan. What remained of the carriers would be scuttled if they could not be saved, and every other ship would prioritize getting clear of waters that now belonged to American aircraft. For the first time since the war began, the Imperial Japanese Navy was retreating, and a fleet that had never once practiced running away now had to do it in the dark, across hundreds of miles of open ocean with no air cover and submarines almost certainly closing in. The retreat itself nearly produced a second disaster. The heavy cruisers Mogami and Mikuma, part of the close escort for the cancelled invasion force, received the order to reverse course and rejoin the main body. In the confusion of the night, with running lights doused and communications still in disarray, a lookout aboard Mogami spotted another ship's shadow dead ahead. The helm went hard over too late. Mogami's bow tore into Mikuma's port side at 28 knots, crushing both hulls and rupturing fuel tanks. Oil poured into the sea, leaving a slick that stretched for miles visible from far above. Both cruisers were reduced to 12 knots, barely able to steer. By dawn, a Catalina patrol plane spotted the slick and radioed the position. Marine dive bombers found the crippled pair before noon. The first strike wounded Mikuma further, but left Mogami still moving. The next afternoon, bombers from Enterprise and Hornet found them again. Mikuma took 5 direct hits, caught fire from bow to stern, and went down that evening with more than 700 men aboard. Mogami absorbed 6 bombs, somehow stayed afloat, and limped home to spend a full year under repair. 2 more capital ships lost not in the climactic battle Yamamoto had planned for, but in the chaos of an unplanned retreat. Across the withdrawing fleet, something heavier than physical loss was settling in. Officers who had spent their careers training for offensive war now found themselves being hunted. American submarines shadowed the retreat routes. Search planes tracked task groups from beyond visual range. The confidence built across 6 unbroken months of victory from Pearl Harbor to the Indian Ocean had evaporated in a single day. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida evacuated from the burning Akagi, and recovering aboard a cruiser later, wrote that the silence among the staff officers said more than any conversation could. Nobody wanted to say out loud what everyone already understood. Japan had not simply lost a battle. It had been outmaneuvered not through superior courage or superior machines, but through intelligence, positioning, and timing it never saw coming. Commander Genda, drifting in and out of consciousness from his wounds, reportedly asked one question of the staff officer beside him. Did they know we were coming? No one answered him directly. They didn't need to. Behind the retreating fleet, the 4 carriers finished dying one by one. Kaga went down the previous evening, capsizing with more than 800 men still trapped below. Soryu slipped under late on June 4th, her captain still aboard by choice. At dawn on the 5th, with Akagi still burning and listing badly, Yamamoto gave the order to scuttle his own flagship, the same ship that had launched the Pearl Harbor strike 6 months earlier. Destroyers fired torpedoes into her hull, and she sank soon after. Hiryu burned the longest. Yamaguchi and his captain refused evacuation to the end, and on the morning of June 5th, the destroyer Makagumo put torpedoes into her hull as a final mercy. She went down mid-morning, the last of the 4. In a day and a half, Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers. 1 heavy cruiser sunk, and another crippled 248 aircraft and 3,057 men, including more than 100 irreplaceable pilots and an even larger number of trained mechanics and deck crew who could not be replaced in months or even years. The survivors were ordered into silence. No casualty lists, no public mention of the carriers. On June 10th, Imperial headquarters announced a great victory, instead claiming 2 American carriers sunk and 150 enemy aircraft destroyed. The Japanese public would hear nothing of Akagi Kaga Soryu or Hiryu for years. But the men who had stood on those burning decks knew exactly what had happened, and in wardrooms across the combined fleet, the same unspoken conclusion was settling in. The war had changed, and somewhere back in Hawaii, the men in that basement office were already reading the next set of messages. What none of them yet understood was just how permanent this loss would prove to be. Japan's carrier strength had been cut in half in a single morning, but the deeper wound was invisible at the time, buried in production schedules and pilot rosters that wouldn't reveal their full damage for another 2 years. America was already laying the keels of carriers that would dwarf anything lost at Midway, 10 of them under construction before the summer was out. Japan's largest shipyard could build 1 fleet carrier every 18 months under ideal conditions, and those conditions no longer existed. The window Yamamoto had warned Tokyo, about the 6 months to a year before American industry simply overwhelmed everything Japan could build, had not just closed. It had slammed shut in the space of one June morning, and the men steaming home from Midway carried that knowledge with them, even as their own government told the country the opposite was true. Word spread through the Pacific faster than any official communique could control it, and what spread wasn't the story Tokyo wanted told. Survivors transferred between ships. Wounded men talked in field hospitals. By the time Imperial headquarters announced its fictional victory on June 10th, the truth was already leaking through the cracks of every port the fleet touched. And for the men actually running Japan's carrier war, the real number mattered more than any press release. 4 fleet carriers gone, 248 aircraft destroyed, and a pilot corps that had taken 15 years to build gutted in a single morning. This is no longer a story about whether code-breaking could change a battle. It's a story about what happens when an empire built on speed and momentum suddenly has neither. Japanese naval intelligence didn't immediately grasp the scale of what had happened to them, but they grasped enough to panic. Within weeks, internal reviews at the Naval General Staff in Tokyo began circulating uncomfortable questions. How had the Americans known the target? How had 3 carriers, one of them barely patched together after Coral Sea appeared in exactly the right stretch of ocean at exactly the right moment? Suspicion turned toward compromised codes, but changing JN-25 entirely would take months Japan didn't have, and in the meantime, Station Hypo kept reading. The intelligence advantage that had won Midway didn't disappear once the battle ended. It kept paying dividends quietly for years. The material crisis was harder to hide. Japan's naval construction program, optimized for speed and offense, had never been built to absorb a loss like this. Shokaku and Zuikaku, the 2 fleet carriers that had survived Coral Sea, were now Japan's only large carriers, still combat-ready, and replacing what Midway destroyed meant years, not months. The Kure shipyard could complete 1 fleet carrier every 18 months under ideal conditions. Those conditions were already gone. Steel allocations were strained. Aviation fuel reserves, never abundant, were shrinking with every convoy lost to American submarines, now hunting more aggressively than ever. Japanese commanders in the field began reporting something that would have been unthinkable in early 1942. Hesitation. Task force commanders who once pressed forward without air cover now waited for confirmation, double-checked reconnaissance, second-guessed timetables. The machine that had overrun half the Pacific in 6 months was, for the first time, playing defense. But the leadership crisis went deeper than ships and planes. Word filtered through the fleet, never officially, never in writing, that the Americans hadn't simply gotten lucky. The same intercept analysis that had haunted Yamamoto's staff in the hours after the retreat order continued circulating among senior officers through the summer of 1942. If the code was truly broken, every future operation carried the same risk Midway had. Plans drawn up in absolute secrecy in Tokyo could already be sitting on a desk in Hawaii before the ink dried. Some officers dismissed the theory outright, clinging to explanations involving spies or radar, rather than admit the cipher itself had failed. Others pushed for sweeping changes to communication procedure. The argument consumed staff meetings for months, and the man at the center of the disaster, Admiral Nagumo, found himself increasingly sidelined from the discussion entirely, his judgment quietly questioned by men who had once deferred to him without hesitation. For Yamamoto, the crisis wasn't theoretical. It was personal, and it was about to become fatal. Even with 4 carriers gone and his strategic position collapsing, he refused to retreat into caution. He continued planning operations through the second half of 1942 and into 1943, still hunting for the decisive engagement that could somehow reverse the arithmetic Midway had exposed. None of it worked the way Pearl Harbor once had. The Solomon Islands campaign ground on through brutal attrition rather than knockout blows. Guadalcanal devoured ships and aircraft on both sides for 6 straight months. And through all of it, the same American codebreakers who had set the trap at Midway kept reading Japanese transmissions patiently, almost invisibly waiting. On April 18, 1943, exactly 1 year after the Doolittle raid on Tokyo, that patience produced its second great strike. Yamamoto had scheduled an inspection tour of forward bases in the Solomons, a routine morale-boosting visit meant to reassure frontline units after months of grinding losses. The itinerary, like nearly everything else moving through Japanese naval communications, was intercepted and decoded. 16 American P-38 Lightning fighters launched from Guadalcanal on a mission with a single purpose: intercept the bomber carrying Japan's most important naval commander and bring it down before it reached its destination. They found Yamamoto's aircraft over Bougainville. In the brief, violent engagement that followed, the bomber was shot out of the sky. Yamamoto's body was recovered from the jungle days later. Japan announced his death in May 1943, declaring a national day of mourning for the architect of Pearl Harbor. What the announcement never mentioned, what the Japanese public would not learn for years, was that the same code-breaking apparatus that had ambushed his fleet at Midway had now killed him directly reading his own itinerary back to the men sent to end his life. The turning point, though, the moment that proved beyond any argument that Midway had permanently broken Japan's strategic momentum, came over a year later in the skies above the Philippine Sea. By June 1944, Japan had rebuilt what carrier strength it could, throwing new ships like Taiho into a desperate effort to reclaim parity with an American Navy that had only grown stronger in the 2 years since Midway. The numbers tell the story before the battle even begins. 9 Japanese carriers, carrying roughly 450 aircraft, faced 15 American carriers, carrying over 900. But the deeper gap wasn't in hulls. It was in the men flying them. Midway had killed the instructors. It had killed the veteran maintenance crews, who once turned a strike around in minutes instead of hours. The pilots Japan sent into battle over the Philippine Sea on June 19th and 20th, 1944, had a fraction of the training hours their predecessors carried into Pearl Harbor and Midway alike. The slaughter that followed earned its own nickname, almost immediately, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. American radar picked up incoming Japanese strikes from over 100 miles out, giving Hellcat fighters time to climb position and wait. Wave after wave of Japanese aircraft flew into a wall of fire from pilots with 3 times the flight experience and aircraft built to absorb damage that would have destroyed a Zero outright. By the end of the second day, Japan had lost roughly 600 carrier aircraft and 3 fleet carriers, including Taiho and Shokaku, the same Shokaku that had survived Coral Sea and Midway both. American losses came to barely more than 100 aircraft. Most lost not to enemy fire, but to fuel exhaustion during the long return flight after dark. The ratio was almost unbelievable on paper, and it was entirely real. Japan's carrier aviation, the force that had once seemed unstoppable from Hawaii to Ceylon, had been effectively erased in 2 days, and there were no replacement pilots waiting in the wings, the way there had been in 1942. Midway had killed the teachers. The Philippine Sea killed the last of the students. News of the disaster moved through the Japanese command structure with the same dull horror that had followed Midway 2 years earlier, except now there was no illusion left to maintain. By October 1944, at the Battle of Leyte Gulf, Japan's surviving carriers no longer even carried meaningful numbers of aircraft. They sailed as decoys, nearly empty flight decks, deliberately exposed to draw American attention away from a desperate battleship force attempting one last surface action. It was, in effect, an admission. The carrier war was over, and Japan knew it. The chain reaction from that one June morning in 1942 had taken 2.5 years to fully play out, but every link traced back to the same source. 4 carriers burned at Midway. Their pilots and mechanics died with them, irreplaceable in any time frame that mattered. The men who replaced them died over the Philippine Sea, with a fraction of the skill their predecessors carried. And the empire that had once dictated the pace of the entire Pacific War found itself by late 1944 reduced to sacrificing empty ships as bait. American war planners watched the trajectory with grim satisfaction. Shipyards in the United States had launched carrier after carrier through 1943 and 1944. Essex-class ships built specifically to replace anything lost and then multiply the advantage many times over. Japan's single shipyard at Kure simply could not keep pace, and after Midway, it never got the chance to try. For the men who had set this entire chain in motion, recognition came slowly and largely out of public view. Joseph Rochefort's work in the basement at Pearl Harbor remained classified for decades after the war ended, his name absent from the histories that celebrated pilots and admirals instead. The intelligence that had positioned 3 carriers in exactly the right patch of empty ocean that had killed Yamamoto over Bougainville, that had quietly undermined 2.5 more years of Japanese naval planning, stayed locked in classified files long after the men who built it had retired or died. But the story wasn't over. Not yet. There remained one final chapter, one almost nobody outside the intelligence community ever fully understood, about what happened to the man in the basement himself, and about the wreckage still resting 2 miles beneath the Pacific, carrying secrets that wouldn't surface again for half a century. The 4 carriers were ash on the ocean floor. Yamamoto was dead over Bougainville. The Philippine Sea had finished what Midway started, and by 1944, Japan's carrier air arm existed mostly on paper. But the story everyone remembers, the dive bombers, the burning decks, the 6 minutes that broke an empire, was only the visible half of what actually happened. The other half belonged to a man almost nobody had heard of working in a windowless basement, and what happened to him after the war is in its own quiet way just as remarkable as anything that happened over Midway Atoll. Because sometimes the people who change the entire shape of history don't get a parade. Sometimes they get silence. Joseph Rochefort did not get a hero's welcome after Midway. He got something closer to a demotion. Within weeks of the battle, a bureaucratic struggle was already underway in Washington over who deserved credit for the intelligence triumph that had positioned 3 American carriers in exactly the right stretch of empty Pacific. Officers in the Office of Naval Intelligence back in Washington, who had initially doubted Rochefort's read on the target and pushed back hard against his basement team's conclusions, were unwilling to let a field unit in Hawaii claim the victory. The internal politics turned ugly fast. Rather than being decorated for what may be the single most consequential piece of signals intelligence in American naval history, Rochefort found himself transferred out of cryptanalysis entirely within months, reassigned to command a floating dry dock in San Francisco, about as far from the war's intelligence apparatus as the Navy could reasonably send him. The man who had read Yamamoto's mail before Yamamoto's own carrier admirals knew what was coming spent the rest of the war essentially exiled from the work he had done better than almost anyone alive. He never publicly complained about it, not really. Those who knew him described a man who simply returned to duty, did what was asked of him, and said almost nothing about Midway for decades. There was no public statement, no memoir rushed into print, no insistence that history remember his name. Part of that silence was enforced classification kept the details of Station Hypo's work locked away for years after the war ended. But part of it seemed to be simply who Rochefort was. He had never wanted the basement job because it offered glory. He had wanted it because the puzzles fascinated him, and because somewhere underneath the irritability and the bathrobe-clad late nights, he understood exactly what was at stake if he got the answer wrong. Recognition, when it eventually came agonizingly late. It would take more than 4 decades until 1985, 3 years after Rochefort's death, for President Ronald Reagan to award him the Distinguished Service Medal posthumously, finally, and officially crediting the man whose basement team had made Midway possible in the first place. His daughter accepted the medal on his behalf. The man who had quietly altered the entire trajectory of the Pacific War never lived to see his country admit it. But here is the detail that should stop you cold. While Rochefort was being shuffled off to a dry dock, the officers in Washington who had doubted him, the ones who had argued the target wasn't Midway at all, went on to receive credit and promotions for an intelligence effort they had actively tried to override. It is in its own bitter way one of the oldest stories in institutional history. The person who is right too early, who proves a comfortable assumption wrong, often pays for being correct. Midway didn't just teach the Imperial Japanese Navy a lesson about overconfidence. It quietly taught the same lesson to the United States Navy, and the Navy, true to bureaucratic form, mostly forgot it the moment the crisis passed. What outlasted the politics, though, was the method. Because the deeper legacy of Midway was never really about one battle. It was about what Rochefort's basement had proven was possible, that signals intelligence patient, unglamorous, and almost invisible, could outperform battleships, outmaneuver admirals, and decide the outcome of a war before the first shot was even fired. The United States built on that lesson relentlessly for the rest of the conflict. The same apparatus that confirmed Midway and later killed Yamamoto over Bougainville continued reading Japanese naval traffic for the remainder of the war, feeding targeting data to submarine commanders who used it to strangle Japan's merchant shipping, intercepting troop convoys, anticipating fleet movements at Leyte Gulf and beyond. By the war's end, American submarines, often guided by decrypted intelligence, had sunk more Japanese tonnage than nearly any other single branch of the war effort, a campaign that traced its operational confidence directly back to the methods proven in that basement in the spring of 1942. The institutional lesson didn't stay buried in the Pacific theater either. The post-war United States built an entire permanent intelligence architecture on the principle Rochefort had demonstrated almost by accident, that breaking an adversary's communications could be worth more than any single weapon system. The National Security Agency, founded in 1952, grew directly out of the code-breaking organizations that had powered Midway and the broader Pacific Intelligence War. During the Cold War, the same disciplined patient interception, painstaking analysis, refusal to accept comfortable assumptions, became the backbone of how the United States tracked Soviet submarine movements, missile tests, and troop deployments for nearly half a century. In Korea and Vietnam, signals intelligence units descended in direct institutional lineage from the code-breaking culture Rochefort helped pioneer. Even now, in an age of satellites and cyber intrusion, rather than paper intercepts and pencil calculations, the fundamental principle hasn't changed. Knowing what your enemy plans to do before they do, it remains the single greatest advantage any military force can possess. And it was a half-mad, half-brilliant basement unit in Hawaii that proved exactly how decisive that advantage could be. It's worth pausing here because the deeper lesson of this story was never really about cryptography at all. It was about what happens when an institution is forced to choose between its assumptions and its evidence. Rochefort wasn't fighting the Japanese Navy when he staged the freshwater deception. He was fighting his own chain of command officers in Washington, who were certain they already knew where Japan would strike, certain enough that they were willing to dismiss the conclusions of the man closest to the raw intelligence. That pattern repeats throughout military history with almost depressing consistency. The officers who dismissed early reports of German armor moving through the Ardennes in 1944 because doctrine said it was the wrong terrain for tanks. The commanders who ignored early radar contacts before Pearl Harbor itself, because nobody expected an attack that morning. Confident institutions built on past success tend to defend their assumptions, even when the evidence in front of them says otherwise. What separates Midway from those other failures is that this time, one stubborn, unglamorous analyst refused to let the assumption win, and he had just enough authority, just enough evidence, and just enough time to force the issue before it was too late. There's a strange symmetry on the other side of this story, too. One most retellings of Midway skip entirely. The same overconfidence that doomed Nagumo's decision-making on June 4th. The assumption that American carriers were still licking their wounds near Hawaii. The assumption that scouting had been thorough enough. The assumption that no one could possibly know Japan's plan was the exact same failure mode that had let Pearl Harbor succeed for Japan just 6 months earlier. The Americans had been caught by surprise at Pearl Harbor, partly because nobody believed an attack of that scale was actually coming despite scattered warning signs. 6 months later, Japan walked into precisely the same trap, dismissing genuine warning signs, because the operational assumption that American carriers were elsewhere simply felt too certain to question. Confirmation bias doesn't care which side of a war it's working for. It is, in its own way, the real villain of this entire four-part story, far more dangerous than any single bomb or torpedo, because it convinces capable, experienced people that they don't need to look any closer at evidence sitting directly in front of them. Which brings us to the detail that almost nobody outside of dedicated naval historians knows, the kind of fact that recasts the entire battle once you hear it. For decades after the war, the locations of Akagi Kagasoryu and Hiryu remained complete mysteries, resting somewhere in roughly 16 to 17,000 feet of water across a stretch of the Central Pacific, large enough that searching for them felt nearly hopeless. In 1998, an expedition led by ocean explorer Robert Ballard, the same man who had located the wreck of Titanic over a decade earlier, finally found the remains of USS Yorktown, sitting almost perfectly upright on the seafloor, her hull remarkably intact, despite the torpedoes and bombs that sank her. 2 years later, in 1999, a separate search expedition located the broken hull of Kaga, confirming for the first time in nearly 6 decades exactly where one of the 4 Japanese carriers had come to rest. But Akagi Soryu and Hiryu remained undiscovered for years afterward, lost somewhere in that same dark stretch of ocean, until renewed search efforts, using modern deep-sea sonar technology, finally located wreckage believed to belong to Akagi and Kaga. More precisely, in the years since vessels resting more than 3 miles down their hulls, scarred by the same explosions that ended the careers of the men who built and crewed them. Every expedition that has gone looking has found the same thing. Ships frozen in the exact posture of their final moments, bomb craters still visible in flight decks that haven't seen sunlight since 1942. A physical record of the 6 minutes that changed the war sitting untouched in water too deep and too dark for almost anyone to ever see again with their own eyes. And here is the twist almost nobody expects when they first learn it. For all the mythology built up around Midway since 1942, the daring scouting flights, the desperate torpedo squadron, sacrifices the dive bombers, arriving at exactly the right second, the entire battle, very plausibly comes down to a single bureaucratic decision made months earlier in a budget meeting. Nobody remembers the decision to fund and staff Station Hypo's code-breaking unit at all, rather than treat it as a low-priority backwater unworthy of serious investment. Had that basement office been understaffed by a handful of analysts? Had Rochefort been transferred out before the spring of 1942? the way he eventually was transferred out afterward. The freshwater deception might never have been conceived. The target might never have been confirmed in time. And 3 American carriers might have remained in Pearl Harbor, while Yamamoto's full force descended on Midway, completely unopposed. The single most decisive naval battle of the Pacific War may have hinged less on courage in the cockpit, though that courage was very real and cost dozens of pilots their lives in the torpedo squadron. Sacrifices alone, and more on whether a handful of underfunded, overworked men in a basement were given just enough resources and just enough trust to keep doing their job for one more critical season. So what do we actually take from all of this 4 parts and roughly 10,000 words later? From one overlooked office staffed by men the Navy initially didn't fully trust and didn't fully fund, came an intelligence breakthrough that altered the entire trajectory of the deadliest war in human history. Joseph Rochefort and his exhausted team at Station Hypo proved that the right insight defended stubbornly enough against institutional doubt can outweigh battleships, outmaneuver admirals, and decide outcomes long before the shooting even starts. 4 Japanese fleet carriers, 248 aircraft, and over 3,000 of Japan's most experienced naval personnel were lost in roughly 24 hours, a blow from which Japan's carrier aviation never fully recovered for the remaining 3 years of the war. That is the power of seeing clearly when everyone around you is certain they already know the answer. If this story taught you anything, it's that history's most decisive turning points rarely look dramatic while they're happening. They look like a tired man in a bathrobe reading the same intercepted message for the 5th time, refusing to accept the comfortable explanation everyone else was ready to believe. Somewhere right now, that same kind of quiet, stubborn clarity is probably the difference between disaster and survival in situations far removed from war rooms and aircraft carriers, in laboratories, in courtrooms, in ordinary decisions nobody will ever turn into a documentary. Midway wasn't won in 6 minutes over the Pacific on June 4, 1942. It was won months earlier in a basement by a man willing to trust evidence over assumption, and that more than any bomb dropped that morning is the lesson worth carrying away from this entire story.